All right, so we are recording. Thank you so much. So the idea for this talk came from, I was speaking with our head librarian, and I was like, oh, I heard that that she was gonna start up these library talk series, and I'm like, oh, I actually just got an article published, and I'd love to talk about it. So a lot of today's talk is gonna be focused on this article that you see here, the title and the abstract that was published in the Journal of Family Theory and Review, which is, I am going to toot my horn because when I was doing this, I did not realize, and now I know, but it's a top tier family science research journal where a lot of the articles that are posted here are about how to better understand theory and review studies around family science to help us better understand and approach family science. And you hear me saying family science. As you might know, I have my PhD in child development, but child development is a very interdisciplinary field, and the way that I come to it and my interest lies in, and I've always kind of worked with before I started teaching, working with children and families, and how do we better understand and support families. So that's kind of what's framing my talk today. And the area of research that I'll be covering a little bit more about is ethnic racial socialization. So for those of you that may not be familiar with it, ethnic racial socialization refers to the ways that families teach their children what it means to be part of their ethnic and or racial group. So I focus on Latinx families and more specifically Dominican families. So in the way that I've put together this paper, I use a lot of my own examples growing up as a Dominican person in the United States, and then also reference some of my research with Dominican moms. So just so you know, that's the area that I study, and I'll say more about the research in a bit. But in terms of a little bit about me, so again, I don't know if students showed up, but I always like to kind of share a bit of my story, including my educational background, because I think it's important and I find that to be valuable for students. So I'll share some of that now. So as you saw, for those of you that don't know me, my name is followed by those 3 letters, PhD. And that's something that for me was a long road, and it took a lot of effort, and I worked really hard to be able to earn that degree. And now that has allowed me to enter these like elite spaces in which there are not many people like me or like those that I grew up with in some of these spaces. And I kind of like to see it as a way for me to like infiltrate, like, all right, I'm in, let's go. And then find ways to represent the lives that I'm very familiar with and that many of you here are also familiar with, that are not always represented or are sometimes stigmatized in the research literature. So through that process, I also realized, and again, it took me a while to realize how my own experiences are valuable. And how do I and I've recognized that, and I've embedded it in my work such that now when you look at my work, it's a very like interesting dance between who I am, my experiences, the experiences of the families that I grew up with and worked with, and then how do we combine that with some of the research and the theoretical frameworks. So it's kind of all a big interweb. For those of you that don't know, my education in higher education, so my higher education journey started off at a community college, which is, you know, Miami-Dade, go Sharks. I know there's some Miami-Dade grads here, yay. So I credit a lot of my academic trajectory to what was happening in that time in my life and how it got me to where I am today. It's also where I started teaching, like before I moved to Chicago. So in flipping it to ethnic racial socialization, a lot of my understanding about ethnic racial socialization came from my own experiences before I even knew about this research. So I was born in La República Dominicana, in Santo Domingo, which is a small island in the Caribbean called Hispaniola, which we share with Haiti. And a lot of what I understand about who I am as a Dominican came from some of those experiences, right? My early experiences living and growing up in DR, but then growing up in an immigrant Dominican family. So when we think about ethnic racial socialization, that is a US American concept. That research was born here in the US. And oftentimes when you speak with individuals from all over Latin America, there's not this huge emphasis on, I am Colombian, or I am anywhere else, I'm Mexican, what have you, in our home countries, because everybody else there is. It's more so something that is more emphasized living in the US. So when we live against the backdrop of US history, that makes certain sense, and also the ways that we are grouped here in the US. But needless to say, a lot of my early experiences helped me understand who I am. So when I think about, so I'm thinking about what that might look like. I grew up speaking Spanish. In DR, everyone was speaking Spanish, so that was my first language. So again, I'm giving you some examples, even though some of those did begin in the DR. I grew up listening to some of the music that you were just listening to. I grew up eating cultural foods like plantains, a lot of rice. And yes, the people that know me are like kind of doing one of the purse and eyebrow raise, because I don't eat beans, because that's a big staple in the Dominican diet. But the beans were there if I wanted them, right? So I understood beans are a thing, even though I do not eat them. And also, like on Sundays, like my extended family, particularly my mother's side, we got together at my grandparents' house. So these are all things that are very part of the culture that I grew up doing while I was living there. When we think about a lot of what was going on in the country at the time, the political and economical climate, that in the Dominican Republic, that's what resulted in my family deciding to immigrate to the United States. And I lived for the majority of my life up until a decade ago or so in Miami, Florida. So interestingly then, I was now surrounded by a lot of individuals from a lot of countries all over Latin America. So I really began to understand a lot of the ways in which there are so many similarities amongst many of us, and that has to do with kind of perhaps importance of family, speaking Spanish for those of us who spoke Spanish, and there's a lot of things that tied us together. Another interesting thing is, like, when you grow up in Miami, you grow up in a context in which things kind of like mold together in a really interesting way. But that's a whole other piece, not part of what I'm talking about today. But I also grew up understanding some of the differences amongst us, even though we were all from a Latin American country. So I kind of understood that. Now, when it comes to Dominicans, for example, we have a really complex history when it related to race, such that influenced by things like colonialism, that brought in like caste system and individuals from other parts of the world, not just Europe, but enslavement to a country that was populated by indigenous persons. So there was kind of like colonialism kind of brought in something to think about when we're thinking about race. Also imperialism and like the impact of the U.S. occupation in the Dominican Republic. Also, there was a long period of a dictatorship that was characterized by anti-Blackness, and that's a history that I spend more time covering in the paper. But when I think about my own experiences, race was not necessarily something that was explicitly addressed. It more kind of came secondhand. We're not quite putting our finger on it, but we're dancing around it. Welcome, thank you, join us. So for example, there's this adage that's called pelo malo, which is something that we talk a lot about among Dominicans. Like hair is like a big thing. For those of you that don't know me, I've got this like big curly hair. However, from a very young age, I was going to the hair salon and getting straightening treatments. My hairline is forever gone, I think. It was at the point I was so little that the hair dryer chairs had like their handles like this, the armrests, and they would put this wooden block or wooden like 4x4, what do you call this? Here for me to sit on so I could reach the hair dryer. That's how young I was going to the salon. And a lot of that had to do with taking it back to this adage of pelo malo. It kind of embodies this idea that natural hair texture that is also linked to Blackness was considered undesirable. And again, these are things that I have come to understand through time, especially time living in the US and kind of approaching this with my US lens along the backdrop of US history. But also as I've gotten older, really kind of thinking through like what these practices meant. So it was like an indirect. So what do we have so far? Then later when I think about some of my professional experiences as a case manager, as an infant mental health therapist, I worked with families from across ethnic and racial groups. And I began to realize at that point when I'm like in these professional spaces, I'm also taking coursework and I'm reading some literature, and I was finding, there's not really something that like exactly addresses some of these experiences that the families that I'm working with are navigate. Then kind of like moving forward to me living here in Chicago, I am in a doctoral program, which is how I met Dr. Very, which is probably, I don't know, I'll say was from when I was there, a very white space. And when I thought a lot about some of the literature that we were assigned to read, I was just kind of like, I'm missing from all this. I'm not here. Like the people I grew up with are not really here. And then that's what eventually kind of led me to recognize or learn more about the ethnic racial socialization literature. And that's when I really found, okay, now we're talking about the experiences of Latinx communities, Black communities in ways that are honoring our strengths and also are not from a space of deficit. Something's wrong with you. And that's what really kind of got me to be interested in this work. And then for my dissertation, I did a research study exploring the ethnic racial socialization practices of Dominican mothers. I was uniquely wanting to know more about that because I was finding, hey, there's not much in the literature. And I know from my own personal experiences that there are some unique things here that I want to study a little bit further. And that's what led me to this space. If you're wondering about the image that you see there, that's a shirt I have. And in that shirt, you see a drawing of these dolls. And these are these faceless dolls, which are now artisan dolls that are very uniquely Dominican. And the original artist who created these dolls, one of the reasons why she decided to not put a face in these dolls is because she was creating Dominican dolls, but there is not one way that Dominicans look. We come from a very racially expansive background and group, whether or not a Dominican identifies with a race. And so she decided to go ahead and make faceless dolls. And then the activities and what you see them doing and their dress represent a lot of typical Dominican activities and styles and things like that. So, and also to highlight the important role of women within Dominican culture. So that's what that's about, in case you were wondering. Okay, so let's get a little bit more into the research. So as I mentioned, ethnic racial socialization refers to the teachings that families of color engage in to teach children what it means to be part of their ethnic and racial group. So, and this is a very salient practice among families of color. And oftentimes, the things that are happening in our everyday is what gets categorized as this. So I'll talk a little bit further and I'll break it down. But a lot of it is part of our everyday practices. So that can look like celebrating cultural traditions, speaking, when we're talking about Latinx families, speaking Spanish in the home. It may also include talking to children about some of the discrimination that they might experience on account of their ethnic and racial identity, and also just like taking pride in your heritage and in your community. A lot of so as I mentioned, ethnic racial socialization, that's something that is uniquely US American. The early beginnings of ethnic racial socialization came from the interest of Black scholars like psychologists, developmental scientists, wanting to know and highlight some of the aspects of Black family life and what is happening within Black families, and what are parents teaching children to help them understand their racial membership. We also use a lot of different terms. So I use ethnic racial socialization, but like as I mentioned, the early work focused on racial socialization. So just thinking about race, you might see racial ethnic socialization. A lot of it overlaps. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the same, but a lot of it does overlap. And that's the umbrella term, but there are actually, as research continues, there's different dimensions of ethnic racial socialization. So the one that I've probably spent a lot of time giving examples so far about is cultural socialization, which refers to practices that are embedded or that are implemented to instill a sense of pride, a celebration, and understanding about cultural practices. So that can look at special events and with celebrations. For example, if you're thinking about Dominicans, then you're playing merengue, and there's like specific foods that we like to eat and things like that. Also teaching about one's heritage and cultural history, that also falls under cultural socialization. Preparation for bias refers to the practices that are aimed at teaching children, and again, remember, these are practices that are for children of color, embedded or implemented to teach children that because of their identity and who they are, ethnic racial identity specifically, they are going to experience discrimination. So for example, when you think about the talk that we often hear about, specifically largely among Black families, but we're also seeing it among Latinx families, particularly for their boys, is thinking about sitting a child down and helping them understand, hey, when you go out there because of who you are, you're likely going to have these experiences associated with discrimination or racism. And the other piece of preparation for bias is, and this is how you go about it. So preparation for bias, hey, teaching that you're going to experience this because of who you are ethnically and racially, and these are some strategies for navigating those situations. Another dimension is promotion of mistrust. So that refers to essentially teaching children to be weary and not trustful of certain groups, particularly when we're thinking about the certain groups who might be the ones imposing some of those racist acts. So really kind of highlighting that to children. Then there's also egalitarianism. Egalitarianism refers to, rather than focusing on your ethnic and racial identity, what's teaching a child that what's going to set them apart is things like hard work and their own merit. So as a way to perhaps combat some of the experiences that they might face because of who they are ethnic and racially. And then there's another category, which is silence about race, which is kind of not having explicit conversation about race. So these are some of the dimensions. We are also seeing some emergent dimensions are that around immigration-related socialization, which is pretty relevant, particularly among Latinx families, in terms of how we might be impacted due to the perceptions, beliefs, biases or that people hold about being from an immigrant background or speaking a language that is not English, like all of the things that we're kind of seeing a lot of, even we've seen them for years, but also seeing them a lot in the news and things like that. There's also like religious socialization, that's also emergent. However, when we think about the research, we don't have time, because I could talk. Okay. When we think about the research, a lot of it focuses on cultural socialization. That's usually what most researchers are looking at. However, it's important to know that when you hear ethnic racial socialization, you want to know, well, what kind? What are you talking about specifically? Why is this important to note? Well, ethnic racial socialization, so these practices that families are engaging in, hello, welcome, they are directly tied to the development of ethnic racial identity, which refers to one's internal understanding about what it means to be part of their ethnic and or racial group. And we know that having a positive, or research suggests that having a positive sense of ethnic racial identity can serve as a buffer against some negative impacts associated, for example, with discrimination. So ethnic racial socialization practices are also serve as that. They serve as a buffer against discrimination. They also contribute to academic adjustment and mental health. Now, you might be wondering, she just said contributes to academic adjustment, like in what way? Good, bad, maybe so-and-so. The research, is specifically when we're thinking about Latinx families, has found kind of like some mixed findings in that some researchers are saying, hey, yeah, this helps improve academic adjustment. Others, they don't have those findings. And some of those inconsistencies have to do with the measures that the researchers might be using. Perhaps some of the measures they're using are not necessarily tapping into the real life experiences of the families that they are interviewing or researching. However, the way I also look at it is some of those inconsistencies has a lot to do with how we are understanding and approaching the families that are being studied. In that context is not necessarily highlighted. So I want to now take us, again, as I mentioned, I focus on Latinx families and kind of highlight some of that. So individuals from Latin America who are here, we are not a monolith. We are so vastly different. We do have a lot of similarities. Like for example, let's take the similarity of speaking Spanish. Many of us, again, not all and also not all Latinos speak Spanish, so there's that too. But for example, so as I mentioned, I am Dominican, my husband is Mexican, and we both speak Spanish, our family speaks Spanish, but we have different words that we use for the same thing. So for the big one, which is always I always ask a lot of follow-up questions. Anyone who knows me knows I ask a lot of follow-up questions. My husband gets them too. So for example, if we're talking about plantains. So we can say that in English because we have like a common knowledge of that. The plantains, the green ones or the yellow ones, whichever ones. My husband, I already said he's Mexican, right? Yeah. So let's go to bananas. He calls bananas plátanos. I call plátanos the plantains. So then I'm like, well, which one are we talking about here? And then they could both be yellow, right? Because there could be a ripe plantain or the banana that's yellow. So I'm like, which one? Because Dominicans, we call bananas guineo. So even in that alone, the fact that yes, someone from the outside, yeah, Latinos, Spanish speakers. Well, okay, yes, for some of us, right? But also even in that, there's a lot of variance. And I just gave you like one short example. And I will say a cute little anecdote. So I have a daughter, and so now I have a daughter who is being raised bicultural or tricultural, right? Because she's U.S. American, Dominican, and Mexican. So for one of the ways that I like to kind of get some ethnic racial socialization in a little bit, especially living in Chicago, in which there's not many Dominicans, and her dad's side of the family lives here, mine does not. we try to put words. So like, for example, beans, my husband calls them frijoles. Dominicans call them habichuelas. So I'm teaching my daughter, those are habichuelas. Probably when she, interacts as she gets older with some of her Mexican friends or what have you, they're like, what are you talking about? But for now, that's a way that I kind of get in there, like some Dominican words and things like that. So that's another example of how language differs. Okay, so let me give you now an example specifically as it relates to ethnic racial socialization. And here I have to make sure I look at the numbers so I get it all. So in 2024, a group of researchers decided to do a review of what is out there in the research literature as it relates to Latinx ethnic racial socialization. And they looked at 38 research articles focusing on Latinx families. Out of those 38, 27, so the majority, covered Mexican families. Now, numerically, that makes sense because Mexicans represent 60% of the US Latinx population. So you would think that there would be more. However, that's a huge difference, right? 27 focused on Mexican families. Now, out of those 37 studies, only 4 focused on Dominicans. And I myself am Dominican, so I took interest to that. And all of those 4 studies included another ethnic group, another Latinx ethnic group. However, let's kind of think about it, more numbers. I hope my husband's proud that I'm using a lot of numbers here today. He's a numbers person. Anyway, so when we think about between the years 2000 and 2021, the Dominican population in the US grew 204%. And that far outpaced the Latinx growth during that time, which overall was 77%. However, when we think about the research literature in ethnic racial identity hasn't kept up with that. You would think, oh, now we're going to see a lot more about Dominican families, and we don't. So why is that even important? Because when we think about how sometimes research is like, oh, this is a research on Latinx persons, I always ask, who are you talking about? Because if we were to take the findings of these 38 articles, and 27 of them focused on Mexican families, and we're implementing that in curricula or policy, what have you, what we're really doing is we are focusing that on our learning about Mexican families, to be really specific, not necessarily the range of ethnic groups within the Latin American diaspora. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to contextualize. So now we get more into like what I bring to the table here. So what I suggest, and that's what I speak about in detail or write about in detail in that paper, is that we should have an approach for how are we studying, and I did this for the study of Latinx ethnic racial socialization, but you can I would love to see someone like adjust this for studying another topic that still focuses on Latinx individuals. So in this 3-step approach, it's a way for us to provide context and more specificity to what we are studying. So there are 3 different steps. The first step I recommend is to specify the Latinx ethnic group. So when a researcher who wants to, for example, study ethnic racial socialization, and they're like, okay, I'm interested in Latinx families, I suggest, hey, who are you studying? Who exactly are you talking about? That specificity allows you to delve deeper into it and have more context for your understanding of your of the findings. So specify the group, and then also, and I hope some of my students are here, select a theoretical framework. We love a theoretical framework. So this allows you to it provides a guide for how you're establishing the context, which I get into step 2. So in my work, I focused on Dominican families, specifically Dominican moms, And I use the integrative model. And the integrative model helps you understand child development, particularly among minoritized groups, to really kind of think about all of the different factors in our lives that have an impact on our development. Once you've kind of done that in step one, then step two is able to establish the context. So thinking about the historical and social factors that might influence what parents do in their home and how they teach their child what it means to be part of their ethnic group. How do their history and social factors play a role? So as I mentioned to you all, let me see which example I want to give here. I'll just kind of repeat the same one to not go off on too many tangents. So when I explained earlier that Dominicans, we have a really complex history as it relates to race, it's important to understand why that is. Because at the surface level, we can be called racist, for example. And I'm not saying that there are no racist Dominicans, because there are. But if you have an understanding as to why is it that Dominicans create a distance with race when the majority of us are dark-skinned and would be identified as Black here in the United States? If you have an understanding about the history and the impact of colonialism, as I mentioned, imperialism, a dictatorship characterized by you are going to be unalived if you are Black or if you defend an individual who's Black, these are things that are going to have deep ramifications and influence as to how parents are teaching their children what it means to be part of their group. Like, this is what you do for survival. So again, I'm not defending one way or the other, but it's important to understand that history to really understand parental and family practices. So that's the step two. That's an example there. So then that gets us to step three. So when we're thinking about step three, this is now the research. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a lot of work at the front end to prepare researchers to better understand the population that they want to work with and specify it, to then engage in research activities. Once researchers have a context and understand how a group works and what are things that are valuable and things like that, selecting a representative team is really helpful. So for example, in my work working with Dominican families, I was the one in the interviews. I am a Dominican woman. At the time, I was not yet a mom, but I was a Dominican woman, and I was able to understand a lot of this like cultural nuance that I didn't miss, but also didn't need to be explained to me because I'm a member of the cultural group that I'm interested in. But I also was working with a student research assistant, and she is from Chile, so she's not Dominican. However, she spoke Spanish, so I was able to conduct interviews in English, Spanish, Spanglish, so like a mix of both, kind of like in and out, in ways that were natural. And the research assistant I was working with was able to code that because she knew Spanish and she didn't have to kind of do extra steps to understand what was going on. And also being part of like an immigrant, so that was also something that was really helpful for both of us. So representative research team, and then also then choosing appropriate methodology. There's a bunch of like research tools and methods that can be used. However, if you're trying to get information and learn more about a particular group, when there is a match between the methods that you're using and the group that you're working with, that allows you to kind of get a little deeper into it. So the methodology that I chose working with Dominican moms was a narrative inquiry. So it had a lot of like storytelling, tell me more about that, and kind of like being able to share stories. Dominicans are storytellers. That's how we, not only because, and a lot of Latinx groups are, but when you think about a lot of the history, when we're thinking about like enslavement, there were a lot of Dominicans, or, at that point, well, let's call them Dominicans now. So like Dominicans that were unable to were not allowed to read, write, and do all of these things. So a lot of what is passed on from time to time is more to do with like through storytelling. And I have a funny anecdote to this. Dominicans are storytellers. I didn't really get that. Like that one skipped me. But I remember I hadn't been to, after moving to the US, I hadn't been to Dominican Republic in a while. And I remember when I went, one of my aunts, and also if you know anything about Dominican moms, they'll like tell you things how it is, even if it's dissing you, they'll just tell you. But I remember being at this family gathering and just kind of like just taking it all in, and everyone's talking and again doing a lot of their storytelling and all of that, and I was just really just taking it in. And my aunt goes to me, she's like, oh, Sabrina, it looks like your mom did all the talking because you're like not doing any talking. And if you knew my mom, some of you who are here didn't know my mom, like she just loved kind of like just talking and saying stories and this and that. So this was appropriate methodology for kind of like an opportunity to like talk and tell me. And I want to hear more about that in a way that helps also participants feel at ease when they're talking to you. And then all of these steps then lead to being able to conducting contextualized analysis and interpretation. So one of the findings from my study was that the moms reported wanting to instill in their children a sense of having pride in being Dominican, but they also expressed a concern and worry on two different levels. One is a concern and worry about how their children might be treated due to either their skin color, their accent, or their Dominican identity. And then there was also this concern about some of the ways that they were raised to believe and understand race, and how that was not the way that they wanted their children to understand race. So that finding on its own allowed, with the context of me being Dominican, but also then understanding Dominican history, that ties back to what I shared in step 2 about the complex history that we have as it relates to race. And that allowed for a deeper interpretation and connecting to our history, why perhaps these parents might be worried about this. And the way I knew that is because I did these steps. And again, when I did these steps, I wasn't thinking about it, but now after you do it, you're like, oh, you can write a paper on the steps. So essentially, that's how that went down. Oops. So all of this to say that in order to make sense of family practices, it's necessary to understand the context in which families are socializing their children to navigate racialized context. Like that's really important. And a lot of the times, families are engaging in this and hello, welcome. And they, it's just part of every day, but that's the goal of these practices, are to help children navigate. But as researchers, we want to understand the context in which these families are doing this. And that's what these steps that I shared here are hopefully allowing us to do. Okay, so when we're thinking about future work with Latinx families, as I mentioned, it's important to name the group that you are interested. And now, as I talk about future work with Latino families, I'm gonna put both the research hat, but also like the practitioner piece too. I think these are all takeaways from different angles. So really think about when you're working with Latinx families, trying to understand Latinx families, really understanding that there's variance among us. And it's important to kind of like name the group that you are interested in. Oops, no, okay. But also it's important, like there are instances, I'm talking about like, oh, you should focus on one group at a time, but there are also instances in which you might want to think more broadly, like when Latinx, Latino, Latina, whatever term you're using makes sense. It's like, no, it's not about the individual groups, it's like broad. So for example, if someone's interested in studying the impact of immigration policy or immigration enforcement on Latinx families, that's gonna cut across all Latinx families because it impacts us similarly. Whether or not someone's an immigrant or not, that doesn't mean that they're not gonna take you if they're out there doing raids or what have you. So if there's impact that kind of cuts across, so that might be an instance in which you want to think more broadly rather than specific groups. It's important to learn the history before you enter a study. It's kind of like more of like take a humble approach to the work instead of going in like, hey, I know all the stuff. Have an open mind, but also do some of the work to learn more about the group that you're interested in. Choose methods that are appropriate. Build context into your analysis. I think I spoke a lot about that. But then lastly, it's really important, and again, this was a journey that took me a long time to really understand how your background and your experiences are an asset to the research. Sometimes if you ever go to like your first research conference or what have you, depending on where it is, it's very easy to be like, for some of us, oh, I do not belong here, right? Because a lot research, higher education are spaces that were not made for many of us. And it's really easy to kind of, not easy, but like it just happens like, oh, I don't know that I really belong here. However, your background and your experience and your insights are an asset to the work. So long as you're engaging in the rigor of learning the material, reading the literature, becoming informed, then there is this other valuable layer that not everybody can bring to the table that you bring through your background. So that's also something that I find that it's not something to apologize for. So that's what I have for now. So we'll take it for, well, we'll do questions, but Dr. Berry's gonna lead us there.
Okay. So do you want to start open-ended and then,
Let's
start with the
prompt.
prompt?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want you guys to think about the beginning of Dr. Mendez-Escobar's talk, and when she was asking us to kind of visualize an experience from your past that taught you or helped you understand that you are part of a specific racial or ethnic group, and this could be multiple groups depending on your situation. Does anybody have an experience or a memory that came to your mind when you thought about that and would like to share?
I like the presentation, though I came.
Thank you for being here.
It is not you alone in the boat. Other immigrants' families also facing the same thing. Because I came here, I married to Turkish guy. I'm from India, South India. My daughter was born here, so something similar scenario, same case. But 4 years she went to the dorm because of the COVID and finished her degree and come back. But trust me, she is 100% American, not Turkish, nothing. Period. So no matter we tried all the parents who are immigrants here, immediate first generation result is that they'll think about her when she have a children, forget our ethnicity, our culture, our food and everything. So practicality is that it is challenging and hard for us to save our culture, ethnicity, tradition, and where we came from back. And he was like, Mom, I know you came from this and that, and so, but I born here. So let me do my way. So I said, okay, even she don't eat like the food she used to eat. Now pasta, this, that, a typical American girl.
Right. No. Thank you for sharing that. And I think when we think about taking it back to this, like the more generations that we've spent here in the US, we do see kind of some less and less of those like motherland, homeland kind of cultural practices. And for me, I think what was really interesting, I could have very much been more of what you shared about your daughter. If perhaps even if I continued living in Miami, I think living in Miami, I didn't really have to question a lot of who I was too much, especially because I would approach anybody and I'm like, oh, I'm Dominican. And they're like, oh, okay, like a slang, a Dominican slang. And they don't have to be Dominican, but they like kind of know about it. So I didn't have to really practice it or think about it. But it was for me, the process of moving to Chicago and like feeling super isolated and alienated, the way for me to kind of get closer to my culture and my group was actively doing it. So I think that was an interesting thing. When you don't have to question it, you kind of don't. And then when it's like in your face that you're the only one and you're like, how am I gonna survive in this space? Or how am I gonna even be myself or what have you? Then you actively do some things. And that's why for me, it's so important to engage in some of these practices at home, especially because my daughter's growing up in a place that there are no other Dominicans for the most part. It's just me and her, and then the one person that I might come across every year or so. So that's also something to think
But
about.
trust me, dear, they have like a peer pressure. They're away from us for so long outside in the school and their social group. And then that very little time we get. So
Yeah,
once
right.
they are above 8 years
Yeah,
or
like
10
it's not
years, forget
happening.
it.
All right, well, I'm hopeful, but we'll see. Thank you, thank you. I know there's some stuff in the chat and then we have a question here. Yes.
Well, I actually wanted to share my experience because I'm second generation from the United States.
Okay.
So my family is Mexican. My mom's parents are originally from Mexico. And when they left Mexico to come to the US, it was like they left everything behind.
Mhm.
They're like all those traditions, the
Yeah.
ones that really, really were ingrained with them from like birth. It was like my mom's mother basically lost her mother when she was a baby, but her siblings basically, my grandmother and her siblings were raised by her tia,
Mhm.
and they lived in Texas. So like a good portion of my mom's family is from Texas. And then when my grandma was old enough, she moved to Chicago, which is where born and raised. And for me, I always felt like different because of the fact that I started out at public school and I was there till first grade. And then after first grade, my parents had me and my siblings go to Catholic school. So it was like a culture shock because of the fact that I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I knew my grandparents spoke Spanish, but I didn't know enough. But when I went to Catholic school, it was bilingual.
Oh,
So that was like kind of scary because I went in like, oh, I'm just gonna make new friends. But it was actually the opposite. They were just looking at me like I was just plain white, like I was American, and they would make fun out of me because I didn't speak Spanish, and I was thrown in the trenches of actually having to learn both languages. And I taught myself how to basically read and write in second grade because the first class that I was exposed to the language was in science. It was the only Spanish class. So
science and Spanish.
yes, so it was just like, oh, the science teacher was Ecuadorian, and he was like, well, I can't teach you Spanish because of the fact that, like, you should have already known. And I'm like, but I don't come from, that upbringing of speaking the language. So he's like, okay, well, I'm going to find you like an English textbook, and then you're going to have a Spanish textbook, and you're going to have to learn both at the same time. So it was like going word by word, trying to figure it out. And then like I would hear like my classmates and people in my community, because I grew up in Pilsen, I was like, trying to figure it out. And then like even when I was out there, like, trying to navigate how to live and stuff like that, I would come across a lot of like my neighbors or just like people passing by, like, oh, where's this at in Spanish? And I knew exactly what to say in English, but I couldn't speak the words because I didn't have the foundation of the language. And it wasn't up until I actually came to city colleges where I was like, you know what, I want to learn. So I took 2 years of Spanish at Malcolm X. And that was basically my beginning stages of trying to learn where I come from. And I want to learn more from where I come from, but it's hard. It's hard because of the fact that a lot of that is gone. My grandparents had passed, so it's like their stories are basically with them. But I'm trying to learn through my tias and tios and my mom about what was it like.
Right. And I think so your example, thank you for sharing that, because I know it's kind of like sharing things that were challenging of growing up. But so I have so many ways to take that, but I'll kind of tie it back in this way. A lot of the research kind of like focuses on these types of like, because we know developmentally identity development and like all of those things, like who am I? Do I really belong in this group? Do I not? And all of that is a developmental task of like the adolescent years. I approach this work of how can we do some things early on to help younger children kind of begin to develop that sense of who they are, so that by the time they get to adolescence, it's a little bit more solidified. But again, because development is so contingent upon your experiences, which is a lot of what you mentioned, things may happen differently. I know for me personally, like my journey into like learning more about Dominican history in a more intentional way, that didn't come until like my 20s. I had a good friend who gave me a book that I really enjoyed, the Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. And in the bottom, there were so many footnotes. I usually was a skipper of footnotes, but then I was like, oh wait, this is like Dominican history down here. And it was a really interesting way to be introduced to my culture in a way that allowed me from like at this experience that I was able to lead, just like the experience that you were able to lead. Oh, okay, when I go to Malcolm X, I'm gonna start taking courses there to kind of like learn a little bit more about this. So I also don't think it's like a too late type of thing. It's an ongoing developmental kind of process. To tie it back to one more thing, I know we're at time, but a lot of the moms that I interviewed, they were like, another theme that came up in that research was that a lot of what they were doing, they were figuring it out as they went. So these were not things that they learned growing up. These were not things that perhaps their families were intentional about. These are things that now, as in their case, because as mothers, they're figuring out alongside with their child. So I'm glad that journey, thank you for sharing your journey. And I feel like yes, right? Super heavy on the footnotes. Up until like a few days from now at the Goodman Theater, they have the play of Oscar Wilde. I went to go see it. It was really, really nice. Cool. Thank you for the chat here, and feel better, Irma. Okay, I think we're at time. So that was good. Thank you for the participation. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate you. Oh, you saw the play too? Okay, nice. Thank you for joining and taking the time. I will see you all when I see you all. Thank you. Thanks. There's some snacks here for those of you who are here. I know I'm trying to be like polite, but there's snacks for eating.
Thank you for